from Happy So Lucky. Today I'm going to show you the technique that I use for paper piecing. There are numerous different techniques. This is the one that I prefer, and so it's what I always use. And I talked about the tools for this in my tools video, and so hopefully you've watched that to know which tools you need for this technique. The pattern that I'm going to be making today is the B from my vintage alphabet pattern, and it's also one of the letters that is used in the Badass quilt that you see behind here. The fabrics I've picked are the Alison Glass fabrics for this particular letter. I quite like them because they are nice and bright and they read as a solid. So the first thing you have to do is to cut out the different sections of your piece, which I have done here. And what I've done is I've pre-cut my fabrics, and I'm pinning the cut-out pieces to my pre-cuts because it makes the whole process a lot speedier. So I have two different sections in this piece. They've got the pre-cut fabrics behind and they clip together. I'm going to show you how you pre-cut your fabrics now. When it comes to pre-cutting your fabric or working out what size you need as you go along, the trick is to remember that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the edge of the pattern, but there's no seam allowance drawn in on the inside seams. So here I tend to add either 1/8 or a 1/4 inch, but on these seam lines I'll add either 3/8 or 1/2 inch, depending on whether it's angled or straight cut. So for this guy here, I'm going to add 3/8 at the top and 3/8 at the bottom. Because it's a straight cut, it's easier to be accurate, so I don't need the extra amount there. So I'm going to cut that one at about 3 inches high, and I'm going to write it on here by, again, an extra 1/8 of an inch over the seam allowance, and then here 3/8 of an inch, but rounded up to 2, so times 2 inches wide. And by writing it on, you could write all your instructions on here for what you have to cut, which enables you to do all your cutting quite speedily, and then put them into a nice little bundle like this, so that you have it all pre-cut. Then you can just sew one seam after the other. It's a lot more efficient. When it comes to the angle pieces, it's a little bit more complicated, but not massively so. So again, you measure the width of it. So that one there I would do about 2 inches wide, and then here we want to go further past the angle. So you have to imagine, I'm just going to draw it in for you, that if that's your seam line, that your seam allowance goes past that for this second piece here. So when you're cutting this piece, you can either cut it from that seam allowance line there, which is here, and add a little bit extra there. So go 1.5, say for example, inches high, and then the width you need to make sure you have extra past these cut edges here. So probably around 3 if you want a rectangle. But it means both of these bits here are going to be throwaway pieces. And given that on this pattern piece you have two the same size, you could cut a square and cut it diagonally down the middle, which would make very little wastage. So for that, what you need to do is you put your ruler on with a little bit extra outside of the seam allowance like that, and measure, if that's where your diagonal line is over there, measure what that length would be. And so that takes us to about a 2.5 inch square. So what I did was, for that piece, is I cut, as you can see here, a 2.5 inch square. I'll put it on the cutting mat to show you. A 2.5 inch square, and I cut it diagonally down the middle. And as you can see, if that goes on the seam allowance there, I've got more than enough excess outside of those cut lines for that piece, and I'll have very little wastage on that one. So now we have our piles pre-cut. And I usually start with section A and work my way alphabetically down there. It doesn't really matter, but it's just more efficient that way. So my pieces that are cut are in numerical order. So I know that this first piece is A1. The trick with paper piecing is you're paper piecing your fabric right side up on the wrong side of the pattern. So it's wrong sides together, wrong side of fabric to wrong side of pattern when it's pieced. Now when you're placing your fabrics, the only piece that you put right side up is the first piece, and we're going to put this on the light table here so that you can see. I'm going to put some glue in section A, And then I'm going to put my fabric right side up on top, making sure that I have sufficient seam allowance all around. Now you can see the seam line is going there, and it's going here. And then this is the cut line, and here's the other seam line. So I've got plenty of space all around. I'm then going to take my add a quarter ruler that I mentioned in my tools video and place it on the first seam between A1 and A2. You always go in numerical order. So I'm going to carefully place the skinny side of the ruler on my seam line and fold it back and make a nice sharp fold there like that. Then I'm going to turn my ruler over to this ridged edge and place that ridged edge butting against that fold, and then I'm going to trim. And what that does is that's given me my seam allowance. So then I'm going to take my next piece, which is this A2 piece, and I'm going to place it right side down onto the right side of that fabric, so it's right sides together. And I'll explain to you why, because when you're going to sew that seam, you're going to sew along here, you're going to flip that around and you'll have your fabric right side up sewn together. But before you sew it, it's right side down. Then we're going to hold it very carefully. So I've lined up these seam allowance edges. We're going to turn it over carefully without moving the fabric, and we're going to go to the sewing machine. Now, the technique I use is I backstitch start and finish. Some people don't do that. They use a different way of doing it. The reason I like to backstitch is because when you pull the paper off, it's more secure. So I'm going to drop my machine foot. I'm going to do 2 stitches in the seam allowance area that I have here, and then I'm going to back it up, and then I'm going to come forward right to this line. So where this T-junction is, I need to stop on that line. I must not go over that line. So I'm right on the edge there, and I'm just going to back it up by a couple of stitches and cut. So as you can see, we've stitched it on the paper side, but our actual finished piece is on the back. And that's why with paper piecing patterns, the letters on this case, or the image, is back to front, because actually your correct side is the back of the paper. So I'm going to turn this piece over, and I'm going to use my roller to give it a roll, and there you go, it's nice and straight. I'm just going to repeat that process for the next one so you can see it again, and you'll see how it all comes together. So the next one, we've gone from A1 to A2, we're now going to A3. I'm going to place my foldy edge on the line, fold it over nice and sharp, cut the seam allowance. And when you first start paper piecing, all these steps seem very jumbly in your head. It's a good idea to do a pattern when you're beginning that's very repetitive, so that you're doing the steps repetitively, because you'll find then they just start to become rote form for you. So again, right side of the fabric onto right side of the fabric, because that there is going to be my seam, and I'm aligning the seam allowances, making sure I have a little bit extra on this side, and then either holding it up to the window or the light, and seeing that I have extra on this side on both of them, so that I know I'm going to have enough seam allowance over here as well. I'm just going to stitch that, making sure you don't move them. Again, a couple of back stitches in the seam allowance area. Stopping when I get to this line where the next section starts, backing it up and cutting. I'll just cut these extra threads off. And we'll fold it over and press. Now, one thing I will point out here is when you use a lighter fabric with a darker fabric underneath, it's possible that that dark pink could show through here. So sometimes You just need to trim a hair off of the underneath fabric so that the seam allowance of the light fabric covers it. And there you have your next section. So as you can see now, we've done 1, 2, and 3, and now we're going to do 4. Now an important thing on this step here, the first piece, A1, we had glued into place. A3 we have not glued into place because we didn't need to. But when we're piecing this place, it's a little bit wobbly. So I always recommend gluing that in place because then, number one, it doesn't go skew, and number two, it doesn't get caught in your seam because it can quite easily fold over and get caught in your seam, and then you have to unpick, which is annoying. So I'm just going to put a little glue there, make sure that the seam is nice and flat there, and glue that down so that it's nice and sharp. Now again, we're going to use the ruler on the seam. So we're going on the 1 to section 4. Going to fold it over, give it a nice press, as you can see on the line, and we're going to cut all of that excess off. So now we have our seam allowance for section 3. We're going to take our piece and we're just going to line that up. Again, lining up our seam allowance perfectly, turning it over to stitch without moving it. And because it's a longer piece, you have to be a little bit more careful about not moving this fabric underneath as you go. Fold it open, give it a nice roll, or an iron if you don't have a roller, and there you can see the bee is starting to come together. Notice how on the pattern the bee was facing backwards because it's on the back of the pattern, but when your piecing comes together it's facing the correct direction. So these were all square cut areas which are quite easy to do, but hopefully now you understand the basic technique for doing it. I'm now going to show you an angled piece and how it's a little different. So on this one here, you can see B1 goes to B2 or B3 that are angled. So we're going to take our B1 piece, and as per before, the first piece down we glue. I'm putting the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the pattern, making sure that I have excess all around as before. Give it a nice press, and then I'm going to cut my seam allowance. So now I'm ready for that piece. Now I cut two options to show you. The one was the half square triangle, which I would just center in the middle there, making sure that you have enough over both edges, and you could just sew that seam, and when you flip it up you'll be covered. You can see over there. Alternatively, you could just cut a rectangle if you don't want to cut the angles, and again there you have it. You just have more wastage on this option. So I'm going to use my triangle one that I've cut. I'm just going to stitch that, and it's exactly the same. I don't have any points that I'm going to now, so I'm going to backstitch in both ends of the seam allowance. Turn it over, roll it. You can see I've got lots of extra fabric to go, which is great. Going on to B3, cut the seam allowance, and that would be this piece that I have now. It's a rectangle. So I'm just going to place that way. And when you do angles, it's always good just to do a double check by flipping it over. So you hold it with 2 fingers, you flip it like that at roughly 1/4 inch, and just check. Either hold it up to the light or you can hold it to your light table and just check, and you can see all the way around you've got enough fabric there. So I'm just going to stitch that one, starting at the seam allowance edge. Coming to this point of this line where the next section starts, and then backing up. And there you have it. We have some angles that have been pieced, and you just keep going with the rest of the pattern. Okay, so now I have both my sections completely pieced, and I'm going to show you how to join them. What we need to do is we need to trim off all of this excess fabric so that I'm cutting it right on the line over here of the seam allowance, not on the stitch line, on the cut line. I'm going to use my larger cutter for this, rotary cutter, only because it's a little smoother. Okay, so now you can see the bee taking shape, and we're going to sew those right sides together along this seam line here. So the way I like to hold them together is, you can use pins, but I tend to use clover clips because I find they keep the seam nice and flat, as opposed to a pin goes in and out and it makes the paper slightly rumpled. And I also find the clover clips are really easy to remove as I go along. The other nice thing about the clover clips is you can put them at the little join marks there and here on the seam line, so that you can fold it back on the seam line quite nicely and see how it's going. Now on this particular pattern there are no critical match-up points aside from the top and the bottom, but if there were, you could be able to see that where these clover clips were if they were lining up. So I'm going to stitch from there all the way along to there, back stitching at start and finish. If your pattern does not have seam allowance, you need to use a 1/4 inch foot for this. Mine has the seam allowance included, so I don't need to use a 1/4 inch. And these larger sections I tend to piece on a number 2 stitch size. It's because these are usually the sections you have to unpick. And unpicking a 1 1/2 or a 1 is impossible. So here we go, we fold it out. I'll give it a good roll. Now, when you first look at it, it looks like there's a weird bit going on here, but that's because this is in the seam allowance. So when that gets sewn into whatever's going around that, in this case the sashing around the letters, that little knobbly bit will be ended there, so the letter ends there, as you can see it. So there's our B. I'm now going to show you another letter which has angled sections, because this was a square section, so very easy to join. This here is an N, and I'm going to show you. So with the N pieces, they're angled, so it's not, say for example, like a right angled fit, like those guys were. It has an angle. Now some patterns don't give you the little corner notches. I try and put them on. All my newer patterns have them because it makes it a lot easier to line the edges up when you're putting the angles together. So in this instance I first have to join A to B, and that goes over here. So I'm going to line the straight edge here is a right angle corner, so that's an easy one. But this edge over here you can see is angled. So this is what I mean by that little notched edge, is it shows you exactly that if you're further that way, you know you're not going to join it up correctly. If that little edge is lined up nicely there and on that side, and you have your seam allowance at the top lined up, you've got 3 edges lined up, so you know it's going to be spot on. But just to be sure, if you want, you can take a pin. And the pin that I like to use this for is these little skinny glass pins, because they're really skinny. So I'm going to pin it in place with my clover clips. And then I'm going to stick a pin through the corner on this side, into the corner on that side. Hang on, I'm slightly off here. There we go. So I can see that it's going to line up perfectly, matching up the corners. And if your pattern doesn't have these notches cut out, that's the best way to know if you have everything in place, is to stick a pin through the corners and you'll see that your corners are going to match up perfectly. Okay, so now we're going to stitch this guy. And in theory, when I fold this back up, this line here is going to continue into the B section. So let's hope that that's correct. And there we have it. It's a nice straight edge is what you're hoping for. So the next section to join on then is, sorry, that one there. But what I'm going to do before I do that is just in the seam allowance here, I'm going to take out this paper, because if you have layers of seam allowance and paper all sewn in together in these little corners, it can be tricky afterwards to remove. So I'm just going to remove a teeny bit there and a teeny bit there of the seam allowance. It'll just make my life easier later down the line. Okay, so now we're going to join this section to this section. So we're going to put them right sides together, and again we're going to line up this seam allowance here, and then we're going to line up the top and bottom notches, as you can see there. So we lined up here, and we lined up on the left and the right sides, like that. And then we're going to clover clip it in place, so that the flat edge of the clover clip is along my seam line. Like that, so that I can just fold it back and check, does everything look good? And I can see from this side that it does, because I'm getting a nice straight line here and a nice straight line there. So I know I'm spot on, and now I'm going to stitch it. Okay, so now when we pull it out, and we, actually I'll fold it that way, fold it out, you have a perfect N, and now all I have to do is add the little serifs onto the base. Again, I'm just going to take that little bit of paper out of the seam allowance there, so that I don't have to fish out later. And this is a straight join, so it's really easy. But the one critical thing in this join is I have an angled line that's joining up. So I'm going to show you how to match that. So as before, I've lined up the seam allowance, the left and the right side. But this little piece here continues down into that angle there, and you can see it looks like it's flipping there, so that's a good thing. We know we're going in the right direction. But what I've done is I've put my clover clip, this pink one, on that line, so that when I flip it over to test it, I can see, does it look like that line is continuing on? And it looks like it is, but just to make sure, I'm going to pre-stitch it. So this is a really good way to test something more accurately without having to spend an hour and picking a number 1 or 1.5 inch stitch, is I put my stitch onto a 3, so it's a nice big stitch. I'm only going to take the middle one out, so I'm keeping the left and right sides together there. And I'm going to stitch just a little section without back stitching, probably 1 inch long across there, just to test it. So now when I'm folding it open, it's going to be quite a clear test, and you can see it's perfect when it's folded. Makes a nice straight line there. So I've put it back again where it was, pop my clover clips in place, and now I can confidently stitch that whole line knowing that that line is going to line up nicely for me. Taking it back down to a 2-stitch, making sure my edges are all lined up and I haven't moved them. Give it a good roll. And that's awesome. It's a perfectly straight line, which is great. But if it hadn't have been when you did your test, the nice thing is you'd have to unpick it, which is unfortunate, but the nice thing is it would be a 3-stitch, so it would be a really quick unpick, and you'd only be doing that little inch. You wouldn't have to go all the way along, so it would save you a lot of time. So there we have it.